up and down and I turn a few flips and I grab her and kiss her on her pretty sweet lips. If I had me a woman, if I had me a woman, if I had me a woman, I would be rolling around.
Hey friends, thanks for watching. This is West Coast Ramble, and we got a special guest here. We got Deak Dickerson. Let's bring him in here. And Deak, thanks a lot for being here on the show. I really appreciate it.
Al, thanks for having me, man. It's been a while, but I'm glad to be back on the show.
Yeah, well, I know you've been all around the world, like following you on Instagram. You just came back from Europe. You were recording in the snow, and then you came back to giant fires. So
yeah,
the
last 3 weeks have been completely insane.
Yeah, I don't know, like you're just trying. It seems like you're just trying to play music, but then you end up having to like go through the world's events.
Yep.
Yeah. So anyways, well, with that being said, if anyone who doesn't know who Deak is, first off, he's a great musician, great picker. I've always listened to him, rockabilly and all that stuff, but he's pretty much a outspoken music historian, so I'm glad to have him here. And what the thing is, I wanted to talk about, first off, you could just kind of tell the audience, like all the peoples that you've rubbed elbows with as far as like musicians, people past and gone. You know, you've been in playing for what, 30 years now, and
yeah. Well, you know, man, that's a big list. Now, earlier when we spoke about this, you said guitar players. Now, are we talking guitar players, or are we talking just general musician entertainers?
Well, you know, I'm a budding guitar player myself, so I like that. But if you got any stories of all the people you've met over these years, I would love to hear it.
All right. Well, the thing is, you said guitar player, so my mind has been working for the last 10 minutes on what I was going to say.
No, well, let's go with
but,
this. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, basically playing with the old timers, the guys that actually did the music, and the ladies who did the music that I love back in the 40s through the 1960s. That's what really thrills me. You know what I mean? Like everything else that people really get off on, the crowds cheering and, making money and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't give me as much of a thrill as playing with the original people. I mean, to me, when you really hit it and there's that spark and you can see what made that music so great in the first place and what made that particular performer so great in the first place, man, that's when, you get the goosebumps and all that kind of stuff. So I've been really lucky. I wanted to do that really early on. I mean, we started backing up old rockabilly guys from the 50s back in the early 90s with the Dave and Deak combo. And, I was in my early 20s and I'm still doing it now. There's just a couple of people left from that era, but I'm still backing them up whenever I have the opportunity.
Yeah, and that's well, let's go back to that a little bit, because I know you started out as just a humble musician, but then you get a chance to back up these the stars. Like, give me a story. Like, what was the first guy or gal that you backed up with one of your heroes, and you said, "Man, I can't believe it. I'm sitting here. I'm backing up this person."
Well, I moved from Missouri to California in January of 1991, and when I got out here to Los Angeles. As you know, Big Sandy and the Fly-Rite Trio, they were really going full bore at that time. And I guess, even though I listened to all these records from the 1950s and the 1960s and stuff, the thought never even occurred to me that you could book somebody like Johnny Powers to come out and play gigs. Yeah. And so I think it was Big Sandy and the Fly-Rite Trio that I first saw backing up some of the originals. And then Dave and Deak went over to Hemsby, I want to say in 92, something like that. And that's when I'm not going to name names, but we saw some really great performers that were backed by a backup band that just did not care. They, they didn't learn the songs. They put no effort into it. They were not excited to do it. You can tell they were just like, there to make $50 or whatever. Yeah. And I remember coming home from that Hemsby saying, look, man, if I ever get a chance to back up these guys, I'm going to make them sound good. I'm going to back them up and just allow them to like shine.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of right after that Lloyd Martin, the original bass player of the Dave and Deak combo, he was managing a bar in North Hollywood, California called the Blue Saloon. And it was really going great guns. I mean, we were drawing big crowds there like every night of the week. And so it was kind of his pet project to bring in these old rockabilly guys and for the Dave and Deak combo to back him up. And at that time, you know, Lloyd and Les, the bartender, they had a sort of like a bachelor pad apartment. And so they would bring guys like Rudy Tootie Grazel in, and then they would just kind of hang out at their apartment, like drinking beers and hitting on girls by the pool. And we would rehearse with them like a couple of times, and then we would go do a show on Friday or Saturday night. And we did that with a bunch of the original rockabilly guys, and it was super fun. But actually, you know what? I think, man, it's so hard to remember dates from that long ago, but I think maybe the first original 1950s guy that I got to back up when I moved out here was Ray Campy, because, Ray was on the scene out here. Yeah. And I told him when I met him, I said, man, I have all your records. I had them in Missouri. And, when I was 15 years old, I idolized you. And so he called me up to do a gig backing him up at the high school where he was a substitute teacher. And this was up at San Fernando High School. Oh. And it was a really interesting gig, because, Mr. Campy came out to perform with his, cowboy outfit and his scarf and his cowboy boots and his upright bass. I can't remember if the upright bass at that time, early 90s, had the Confederate flag on the back, or later he switched to the Texas flag.
Yeah, good idea.
Right. But the audience at San Fernando High School was literally split into this half of the auditorium was all the Mexican kids, and this half of the auditorium was all the black kids. Wow. And then we were supposed to go and play rockabilly music for them, So you can imagine, like, they liked it because it was Mr. Campy and they liked him, but they all thought it was like super goofy. And then I remember doing a Richie Valens song, Come On, Let's Go.
Sure.
And the Mexican side of the auditorium just went completely insane, and the black kids just kind of stood there just completely silent and kind of angry looking. But that was the first time that I ever backed up a guy from the 1950s. And there were several of the Rollin' Rock guys that were still around at that time. Tony Khan, got to back him up, and he was just he really was a wild man. And then, like I said, we started backing up some of these obscure rockabilly guys like Rudy Tootie Grazel and Johnny Meeks from the Blue Caps. We backed him up a few times, and man, it just kind of kept going from there.
Yeah. Well, I've seen you play a lot of time with these guys, and it's always like you have full respect for them. Like if you think about it, like maybe they've been out of the music scene for a while, but when I would see you with them, it's like you pulled them back. Like you said, you guys weren't a band for hire. You were people who like you understood the music and you brought it back to like its original form. It wasn't like you're playing with a guy with electric bass and a guy's playing the wrong guitar. Like you guys did it accurately. And if I was them, I'd be like, man, where'd these kids come from that know all this music the right way?
Yeah. Well, probably the first sort of high profile thing that the Dave and Deak combo got was an offer to back up the Collins kids at the Hemsby Festival in England. Yeah. I think it was either 92 or 93. I can't remember. We did it a couple of times. But in order to get the gig, we had to drive up to Reno, 500 miles, and audition for Larry and Lori Collins.
Really?
Now, Larry had been doing stuff throughout the urban cowboy era, and that was really where his mind was at. He really was kind of like a very much like hanging out with Chris Christopherson. That was where his mind was at, you know. And you could tell that he hadn't really thought about 50s rockabilly in a very long time.
Yeah.
And we showed up there, and the promoter had told them, like, you have to do these songs. You have to do whatever, Hoy Hoy and Rock Boppin' Baby. And so we started going through those songs, and I could just see like this kind of light in both of their eyes, Larry and Lori, where they were like, oh crap, these guys actually sound like the real deal. They sound like the way our record sounded in the 50s. And then Larry dug in, and he gave me that look, that.
Yeah. like he's an 8-year, like a 10-year-old kid or whatever.
Yeah. And we all got goosebumps because it was like, wow, man, we're actually playing with Larry and Lori Collins, the Collins kids. Yeah. And that turned out to be a really great partnership. We backed them up a number of times, and I think that we did a really good job backing them up. And Larry and I were full on guitar buddies, with the Mosrite double necks and all of that.
Oh yeah. And one thing I just want to bring up was the fact that, like, I'm an older guy. I'm like 58 years old. And how old were Larry and Lori Collins at that time? They probably like 50 years old or something, or like they couldn't have been that old.
Yeah. Dave Stuckey and I were talking about that not too long ago, because when we first met these people, 35 years ago, I was in my early 20s. And, I thought the Big Sandy guys were old because they were all like 25 to 30 years old. You know what I mean? They were all like 5 to 10 years older than me. And then we're backing up these guys from the 50s. I'm like, man, these guys are ancient. They are elderly, And then just like a year or so ago, we did the math and we're like, man, these guys were like in their late 40s when we were backing them up. Yeah. Like they were still in good shape. Yeah. They were not old. They were not even old by today's standards.
No, not at all.
And, I always think about that whenever I'm talking to some young, 21-year-old rockabilly kid, like, oh my God, I look like I'm 100 years old to this kid.
Yeah. Yeah. The whole thing of like, it's just the way it goes, man. And you start putting it back, you go, man, well, George Harrison died about this age. I'm outliving George Harrison. So I guess I'm doing pretty good, but
yeah. Well, and if I'm going to seg this subject and keep it going. So a few years later, like, over the next 10 years, I started doing these guitar geek festivals, and the Guitar Geek Fest
I love those. Those are great, yeah.
It became sort of a big thing. We were doing it around the NAMM show, which is happening this weekend down in Anaheim.
Yeah.
And partially my goal was to put on a guitar show that was not like any of the other guitar shows that you could go and see. Because all the other guitar shows had the same guys, and it was just all noodly, 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 wank, 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 like 12-minute solos. And I'm like, look, I want to put on a guitar show that has the sort of people that I want to see. Yeah. And so the other half of that ambition was, okay, you know what? There's still a handful of guys that I have not got to play with yet. And this is a really good excuse to book some of these people, like Noki Edwards, like Dwayne Eddy, et cetera, and get them down to the show and back them up. And so that's exactly what I did. And that was a ball. It really was a blast. And I got to meet and play with several of my heroes and get to know them pretty well.
And here's the thing is like, you had me work the first couple shows helping you out with some video stuff. Mm-hmm. But I was thinking, man, this guy, Deak, he's getting here early before everyone gets here. He's the last one to leave. You put so much energy into that whole thing. Like it seemed like you're doing it by yourself, but it was like people like almost religiously loved to go to that thing. Like every year I'd be like, oh, that's so awesome, dude. He's going to have the Ventures. Like to me, it was magical, and I dare say this, but it was like a lot of those guys were still alive and still kicking and making music, and you documented it. It was a worthwhile event what you're doing for sure.
I appreciate you saying that because, I did 10 of those down there in Anaheim, and we videoed all of those, and we put 9 of them out on DVD, and I'm really proud of it. But man, it was so much goddamn work. I mean, it was like 3 months out of the year, I'd be working full time on this thing, like 40 hours a week. Then I would lose money, like I wasn't even making money. And the whole concept was, okay, so I lost a couple of grand on this, but then we're going to sell tons of DVDs to make up for this. And it was, we got maybe like 3 or 4 years into it, and the sales of DVDs just started going down and down. And by the time we got to the 9th one, it was like, nobody's buying DVDs anymore. So every now and then people will ask me like, "Don't you miss doing the Guitar Geek Festival?" And I just think about how bad my feet would hurt for like a week afterwards, man. I would be like a 90-year-old man, like just barely able to walk because I had, put so much physical effort into the damn thing.
Well, and you did the Lord's work, and you did your time. No one could say you didn't put your time in. One of the things I thought was cool is one time you had this like headbanger dude play there, and he was awesome. And it was like, I liked it because back in those days, like me, I was like, oh, I only want to hear rockabilly, nothing back from 80, anything back. And so you brought this guy in there, and like he was really entertaining, and I thought, that's cool, man. Deak you're bringing out talent, and you kind of open it up for a lot of people. For me, I thought, okay, I get this guy. I get where he's coming from. He just wants to entertain just like anybody else. And he ripped, like everyone you brought in here was not a slouch. Like it was a high quality guitar show, So I appreciate what you're doing, It was more for like the music's sake. You weren't like trying to make some artistic statement. You were just out there almost like, let's get these older guys, give them a chance to show what they still can do, and other guys what they're doing. It was a good thing.
Yeah, and like I really wanted it to be very inclusive. I mean, I wanted there to be rockabilly, I wanted there to be surf, but I also wanted there to be like blues and country and metal and western swing and just we had a couple of performers. I'm not even sure you could even classify their music, and
cool.
I also recognize that the guitar scene, it's just got a lot of white dudes in there. So any chance that we had to feature somebody like Jennifer Batten, who's a fantastic female rock guitar player, we would bring them in, and so I'm kind of proud of how we did it because I was able to do that, make it an inclusive kind of a show, and yet it was still cool and not boring. Like I'm pretty sure that shredder guy you were talking about was Paul Gilbert, who was in the metal band Racer X back in the 80s.
Yeah, probably.
And he's one of these guys that he's real famous for being like a guy that gives lessons and clinics and things like that, and he does play gigs and everything, but I saw him play and I was so blown away. I was like, I got to get this guy for the Geek Festival. And when he did the Geek Festival, people were just he literally melted their faces because he did like a Rolling Stones song, he did a Miles Davis song, he did a shreddier heavy metal song. And even though he was playing like a million notes a minute, he's probably the only guy I would ever say that I would classify as a shredder that really had a lot of musical soul in his playing. I'm sitting there watching him play like, but I'm just like, the dude is still soulful and he's still musical. I'm not sure how he does that, but I'm really impressed.
Yeah, I know. And also you had Brian Lowenbeck there. And
we had Brian Lowenbeck every single year.
Yeah, like people said that, oh, that guy again. Every time I saw that guy, I was like, oh, wow, where's this guy been? And that's what gets me. You hear all the music I like, and you're all, why isn't this stuff like number one on the radio? How come we don't hear this on the radio? But I don't have an answer for that. And I also wonder, like, where guitar seems to be, except for like country music, is non-existent in popular music now. And I did want to ask you, like, what's your prediction in the future for guitar music?
Well, what's an interesting fact that I read is they actually are selling more guitars every year now, like currently, than any other year in the past. And I'm not really sure how that's possible because the guitar gigs are like, they're like this tiny little percentage of what they used to be. Yeah. So I think it's one of those instruments that people are always going to think are cool. The guitar is just cool. Yeah. I'm not trying to hurt any clarinet players' feelings, but the clarinet is not universally regarded as a cool instrument. No. But you go into Guitar Center and you still see lots of young kids like buying guitars because they think it's cool. Now, whether or not those kids are ever going to have a paying gig or a career or anything, I doubt it because the nature of live music and music creation has been dwindling and dwindling and dwindling. over the years. But at the same time, I think people just kind of like having a guitar around and learning how to play on it and having it around the house. So I don't think that's a bad thing. And as far as the future goes, if you're producing 1 million guitars a year and somebody's buying them, there's a future to it. I just don't know what it's going to be.
Yeah, perhaps it's more YouTube stuff. Like now I can get a lesson. I don't know a lick. I'm just go on YouTube and find that lick right there by some guy showing it off. So and maybe that's what it is. Yeah. Oh, maybe you got something there, Deak. Doing your Deak Festival. You could also do your. How come you don't do lessons and do all that kind of stuff like everybody else out there? You're probably too busy.
I'm busy, and I've never been a good teacher. I've tried giving guitar lessons over the years, and it's like, what's interesting is that the best guitar teachers, it never really correlates to being like the best entertainers or performers, right? It's just people who have that like kind of teaching gene in their DNA, and I don't have it. So I'll let the people who are really good at giving lessons do it. Like Tommy Harkenrider is a great example. He's a great player. He's killer on stage. Yeah. But then, man, he's just got that teaching DNA, and he's so good at it. So I just, let a guy like that do it.
Yeah, yeah. And one other thing I did want to get into is like, I see all your recording stuff back there. Mm-hmm. And if I may boast a little bit, I'm a reality shooter. So I was working out here in Nashville, and we did a show for Netflix where guys were writing songs. What they did is they got songwriters. They had 3 hours to come out with a song, and a guy had a computer, and one of the producers would send them a beat on their phone. They get a beat, and then they would try to come up with lyrics for it. And maybe a guy might have an acoustic guitar. And the whole thing was like, they do a whole song basically on the computer right there in a couple hours. And, whenever I'm always watching your YouTube, your Instagram stuff, and you're always recording bands and stuff in your style. What is the Deak style of recording compared to today's style? And what do you have to say about, computer generated music now? Figuring that our music, rockabilly roots music, is so raw. It seems like it's better when it's live to me. But what is Deak doing now?
Well, to me, the whole art of recording is making stuff sound good, or maybe you want to intentionally make it sound bad, but in a way that it's bad good. So, I know that some of you guys understand that. But at my studio, I use a mixture of like really antique tube stuff because it sounds good, and modern digital stuff because it sounds good. There's nothing in my studio that I keep around because it sounds terrible. And I really held off on switching over to, using Pro Tools on the computer until I started getting some film and TV work. And then you have to learn how to do that.
Yeah.
And to me, Pro Tools is just like a neutral storage area. It doesn't sound like anything. If you have vintage microphones like I do and vintage preamps like I do, and you go into Pro Tools, that's what you're hearing, Yeah. And I think a lot of the people that complain about the way that digital sounds, they don't have good microphones, and they don't have good preamps, and they don't have good rooms, and they don't have good instruments. And so to them, it sounds cold, like they're expecting the gear to somehow impart some sort of magical talent on them. And that, that's just not the way it works. So for me, recording is an art of capturing what's there in the room.
Yeah.
And I always encourage bands to record as much stuff live as possible. And, my room is not big. I use my living room as my live room. It's got a nice vaulted wood ceiling. And I'm not sure the exact dimensions, but it's not super huge. But, man, I get really good sounds out of there. I get a really good drum sound. And at one point, we had the Groove Empire Orchestra record here, 8 pieces, all live. Yeah. I had the vocalist isolated in this room, but the other 7 pieces were out there, the horn section, the keyboard player, the drummer, the bass player, the guitar player. I'm trying to remember what else. It sounded great. It sounded fantastic. That's the way you're supposed to record soul music, is a bunch of guys live in a room. And same thing with rockabilly music. You're supposed to record that music with everybody live in a room playing together.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can really get the feel that you're after by doing it the Nashville way, like you were describing, where you have a click track and you overdub the acoustic guitar, and then you overdub the bass, and then you overdub the drums, and then you overdub the electric guitar, and then you overdub the vocals. I mean, you can get something that sounds professional, and certainly most, if not all, of the records that you hear on the radio these days they're popular songs are done that way. But the music that I really love is it's all created by musicians playing live in the room together and feeling that energy off of each other.
Yeah. Can you name some of the man, you've done so many things. Like now I'm starting to remember, you did some stuff for like Johnny Knoxville for his show. And name some of the other projects you've done for LA for Hollywood stuff.
Well, I've done a ton of stuff for Johnny Knoxville. He's been a really great supporter of me over the years. The first thing that I did for him was the Wild and Wonderful Whites of West Virginia documentary, which was 15, 16 years ago. And then I did a bunch of songs in a Jackie Chan movie that he did. I did a bunch of songs for a ABC TV pilot that never took off.
Sure.
I did a bunch of songs for this movie called Action Point, which came out. It was theatrically released, and I had 17 songs in that movie and the theme song. I had a song in Jackass 3D. I had two songs in Jackass Forever. And then most recently, he had a TV show on ABC called Prank Panel, and I did the theme song for that. So absolutely, Johnny Knoxville has been my number one guy, and I really, really appreciate his support over the years.
Yeah.
But I also have done a bunch of stuff for HBO and Cinemax, and I had a song in that movie Sideways, which won Best Picture. The Oscar movie.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Now, yeah. Well, it's funny because when they sold me the project, it was like, oh, we've got this cool, independent film with Paul Giamatti, and I'm like, okay, cool. And they paid me this very small amount of money, and it was independently released originally, and then it was like kept winning all these awards, and eventually it won Best Picture, and then it was like in every every theater in the country, and then it was a classic thing where I can say, yes, I have a song that was in a Best Picture Oscar movie, but it was like the smallest paycheck I ever got too.
So you didn't get residuals on that? Is that what you're saying?
That's a long story. The song itself that I recorded for Sideways, the music supervisor was trying to help out a friend of his who had passed away. Because he had passed away and had a bunch of medical bills and stuff. And so he asked people doing songs for the movie, like, hey, will you record my friend's song? And that way his family will get the residuals. And, hey, great. Good for them. But at the same time, if they had come to me and said, hey, we're going to do a movie that wins Best Picture in the Oscars, I definitely wouldn't have done it for the money that I did it for.
Yeah. Well, you know what, Deak, maybe you're a great artist, but like great artists, you need a manager or something,
Oh, I absolutely need a manager. The problem is that, when you read stuff like Justin Timberlake got signed, or not Justin Timberlake, who's the other cute Muppet boy who's now sort of like all covered in tattoos and doing bad things. I'm not forgetting his name.
Justin Bieber.
Yes, thank you, Justin Bieber.
Big fan.
When you read things like Justin Bieber got signed because he had a cute haircut in his YouTube videos, you're just like, yeah, okay, that's not going to happen for me. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I don't. Wait, now the other day you had the guys from the Spencer Blues Explosion. I saw they were in there. What were they doing? Because they're just kind
that was
funky,
a real surprise.
Funky music. Like what were you doing with those guys?
Well, I've never met Jon Spencer. Hopefully you can edit these things to make me sound less of an idiot. But I had never met Jon Spencer, but we sort of ran in the same circles, and we had some mutual friends. And Bloodshot Bill texted me and said, "Hey, Jon Spencer wants your phone number. He's going to be in LA and maybe wants to record at your place." And so
Yeah.
I texted with John, and he said, "Yeah, we're doing 3 or 4 shows in the LA area, and one of those days we would love to come by and record a couple of songs." Which reminds me, I got to write on my to-do list here: mix Jon Spencer songs. I have been putting that off because of all the fires and all the other stuff.
Yeah.
And they came by and we set up some microphones and they started playing, and he had a super tight band with this young bass player and drummer that apparently he recruited out of the Schooler Rock band up in Woodstock, New York, where he lives. They're very young, like 20, 21 years old, and they were excellent musicians. So all I had to do was just start the tape rolling, and man, it was like we were done in a couple hours.
Oh, that's killer. And I assume how much overdubbing were they doing? Did they do it all live, or I assume a couple of overdubs?
That's what I thought was going to go on too. But I set a Shure 57 up for vocals, and I said, "Hey, you can do your scratch vocals on this, and then we can redo them." And we did the songs, and he's like, "Yeah, just use those vocals." And for that kind of music, I listened to the playback. I'm like, yeah, it sounds great. Actually, there's no need to set up a nice Neumann mic or an RCA ribbon. Like, that's the perfect Jon Spencer vocal take right there off that Shure 57.
Yeah, like I've listened to some of his stuff, Baby Driver and stuff. That's where I first heard his band. Like, I thought, man, all this stuff is so funky and weird. Like, I thought, was he sitting there at the computer, like putting this all together, or were they just sitting in a room and just coming up with it? Because it's pretty raw. You can tell the energy. I can, but
yeah. Well, and if you look at those old videos of the Jon Spencer Blues Explosion playing live, I mean, man, they had that stuff locked in. And same thing with this current band that he has. I mean, there was stuff. One of the songs, like changed kind of time signatures and the way that they did it, man, it sounded like an edit, but they just did it live.
Really?
So I think that they are just really excellent at what they do, and they play all the time, so they're really tight.
Yeah. So to go ahead and segue now, I wanted to go because I see the Mosrite banner behind you over there, and I know you've written several books, but I did want you to get into the Mosrite book, figuring I'm a big Ventures fan as you are. But I don't really know who else who was into the Mosrite, and how did you get into that, and who have you met so far that you've been doing this Mosrite book, and when does it come out?
Well, probably like yourself, the first exposure I had to Mosrite guitars was on the back of all the old Ventures albums. They had a picture of a Mosrite Ventures model, and it was like, the Ventures play the Mosrite Ventures model exclusively.
Yeah, you get the guitar and you get a good-looking girl. Yeah.
When I was growing up in Missouri, I didn't really see any Mosrites. I mean, I'm sure that they must have been out there, but they were not common at all. And then I got into the Collins Kids and Joe Maphis, and they were playing those fabulous 1950s Mosrite double necks, with all the decoration on them and everything. And I was just fascinated by those guitars. I was like, what are those? And, at some point it clicked, like, oh, that's the same Mosrite company that made the Ventures guitars.
Yeah.
And then I became a Ramones fan, and it was like, oh, Johnny Ramone plays this Mosrite guitar. And when I moved out to California, I remember the first time that the Dave and Deak combo played up in Bakersfield. We went to this pawn shop, and there was a Mosrite double neck for sale there for $300.
Whoa.
And even then, that was a cheap price. It was kind of like a spare parts double neck. It was kind of funky. It was not all straight, but it was a playable guitar. Yeah. And Dave Stuckey had to loan me the $300, which I paid him back, $50 a time. And that was how I started playing the Mosrite double neck with the Dave and Deak combo, which then got us the gig to back up the Collins Kids. And, then I wound up backing up Noki Edwards of the Ventures. As time went on, I just had kind of a fascination with the brand. And for those of people out there who don't know anything about Mosrite guitars, it's an interesting story because it's not like Fender or Gibson where they had a giant factory. It was basically the story of this guy, Simi Mosley, and his brother, Andy Mosley. And they grew up around Bakersfield, and they were Pentecostal gospel musicians. You know, they played music in the church.
Yeah.
They were like, you know, hardcore Pentecostal. If you know anything about that Pentecostal music, it sounds like rock and roll, except that they're singing about Jesus.
Yeah.
It's really like kind of, you know, wild up-tempo music. You know, the Pentecostals are the ones that speak in tongues, and, you know, some of the Pentecostals in the Deep South like do the snake handling and all that.
Cool.
So as far as church music goes, like, you know, it was rock and roll. and Simi invented this guitar in the mid 1950s. It was a triple neck guitar that he played, and, you know, it was a crazy looking thing. And, you know, he would go around and play these gospel revival meetings, you know, Simi Mosley and his triple neck guitar. And then he wound up meeting Joe Maphis, building this double neck for him, meeting Larry Collins, building this double neck for him.
Oh.
He began building guitars for other people on the Town Hall Party TV show, or modifying their guitars to have, you know, custom pick guards and their name in the neck and things like that. And he was living in LA during the 50s when he was doing all that. And then he moved back up to Bakersfield in 1959 and kind of gave up for a while. And he was sort of a nomad. He would go preach, and he would play gospel music, and he would make a couple guitars here and there.
Yeah.
But he was just making guitars out of his garage and a tin shed that they rented from a fiddle player up there named Jelly Sanders. And that was when Nokie Edwards happened to play one of these guitars while he was up there. And he said, hey, you know, the Ventures have been looking to have a signature model guitar, and I like this guitar. Like, we should go into partnership together. And so virtually overnight, the Ventures invested something like $100,000, and he built a factory in Bakersfield, had a bunch of employees. All of a sudden, instead of making guitars one or two at a time, he's literally like gearing up to make them, like, you know, hundreds of guitars a month.
Can you back up a little bit? Because
sure.
So like the Ventures, they're out of like Seattle, right? So,
but they were living in Los Angeles at the time.
Okay, so was this like 1962 or 63? And like, was it like Walk Don't Run came out? They made a bunch of money, and they said, let's go with Mosrite.
Well, they, you know, a couple of things happened with the Ventures band. First of all, they moved from Tacoma, Washington down to Los Angeles. The second thing that happened, you know, they were playing Fender guitars, and Bob Bogle was the lead guitar player and Nokie Edwards was the bass player.
Oh.
But Nokie was such a good guitar player that by around 1962, they decided, you know, Nokie should be the lead guitar player and Bob should be the bass player. And they did that, and almost immediately their sound changed. You know, they sort of became more aggressive sounding, and they also changed the drummer. They got this fabulous drummer named Mel Taylor, who was just a really hard-hitting, fast, crisp drummer. So it really became a new band around that time, and they were making a bunch of money, and so they were looking to endorse a guitar, you know. And this Mosrite thing just kind of dropped in their lap at the perfect time. And so they invested a bunch of money with them, and Simi went into mass production, and they made thousands and thousands of these Mosrite Ventures models before going into bankruptcy in 1969.
Oh.
And the Ventures deal fell apart in 68, and it just all kind of, it just kind of ended after that. And then he went back to living this sort of nomadic lifestyle. I'm not going to go through the whole book here, but I'm going to touch on some of the high points. He, because I find it to be a fascinating story. He made this red, white, and blue acoustic guitar for Buck Owens. And the first couple of episodes of Hee Haw, Buck Owens is playing a Mosrite red, white, and blue acoustic guitar.
Whoa.
And so this was going to be what saved Mosrite and got him back in business again. Unfortunately, Buck Owens kind of screwed him on that deal and went with Harmony to build these very inexpensive red, white, and blue all-American guitars.
Oh.
And so that fell through, but Mosrite was definitely the ones that, you know, came up with the red, white, and blue guitars, and Buck played them first. So he kept having these attempts to reboot the company without much luck. And then starting in the late 70s, all these punk rock and new wave guitar players started playing Mosrite guitars. You know, Johnny Ramone from the Ramones, Ricky from the B-52s.
Yeah.
You know, there's a bunch of different ones. And then getting up a little bit further on, Kurt Cobain from Nirvana played a Mosrite. And so then all of a sudden there's this new rebirth of Mosrite guitars with all these punk rock and grunge guitar players who play them just because they think they look cool, you know, and they have a certain sound. Yeah. So by the time that Semmy Mosley died in 1992, you know, he had made this incredible arc from, you know, Pentecostal church music to country music to rockabilly to surf music to, you know, and I should also mention that, you know, at the time that they went bankrupt in 1969, that the #1 album of the year was In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida by Iron Butterfly, and they're pictured playing two Mosrites on the cover, you know, so it was like they sort of went through like the acid rock phase, right? And then have all these like punk rock and grunge guys get into them. So it was really an interesting story, and it's never been documented. And I knew that it had to be done properly. And there's also like you might appreciate this. There's a whole angle to the Mosrite story. They became hugely popular in Japan because the Ventures were more popular than the Beatles in Japan.
Yeah.
You know, they played instrumental music and they played a lot of songs in minor keys, like a lot of Japanese music is in minor keys. So they became huge stars, and Mosrite guitars became super popular in Japan. And in fact, there's still a couple of companies that are making Mosrite guitars over there now. They're not real or authentic Mosrites, but the name continues, and it's still a thing over there. So in addition to going and interviewing all of these people here in America for the book, like at some point this next year, I'm planning on taking a trip over to Japan with my friend Adam Tober, who speaks fluent Japanese.
Oh, wow.
And going and interviewing some of these older Japanese collectors and photographing guitars over there.
Oh, that's amazing. Man, you know, and like, well, I just loved all those. You're totally right.
But yeah, there's so many different elements to the story. I mean, it's.
Yeah. I was just so fascinated by the fact that, like, when I first saw it, you know, when you're a kid and you first look at guitars, and I saw like the back, some picture of the B-52s, or Ricky's playing his Mosrite. It's blue, I think, the guitar, but he's only got like the top two strings and the bottom strings, and I'm all, is that how that guy gets that tone, or is it the guitar? And there's like, oh, hold on a second, sorry. And anyways,
hello, baby.
Yeah,
Sorry.
We'll get into that in 1959, February 4th. But anyway, though, So anyways, I love the look of the guitar. It's like when you're a kid and you see that, you're like, I don't care what it is. It the sound? Is it the look of the guitar? And he had like grip tape or something like that, holding the strap together. And I thought, like, yeah, that's what I want my guitar to look like, you know. And like,
right,
so it's like I wonder, like, are new kids going to be coming out with these things? Are they going to want to play Mosrite guitars? And like, are they going to become collector's items? Because obviously there's no more pure Mosrites anymore. It's like, how does someone get
They're already collector's items for sure. I mean, I see people paying a lot of money for guitars that they're buying off the internet. And I always tell people with Mosrites that the production was pretty inconsistent. And, you know, if you get a guitar that was made by a teenage kid in Bakersfield at the factory on a Friday afternoon, it's not a great guitar. You really got to play them first. But, you know, I will say this. If you find a guitar that Semmy Mosley built himself and did the assembly and the setup and everything, that's a magic guitar. That is a guitar that virtually plays itself. And, you know, you can't determine that by buying it off of eBay or Reverb or something like that. So I always tell people you gotta play them in person, and don't spend a bunch of money for a guitar that you haven't played yet.
And the only way to know is by like playing it. It doesn't say, like, it doesn't have his name's etched in it in the body anywhere or anything, or.
I mean, some of the later ones, the ones made in the 80s, he would sign on the back, you know, in the early 90s.
Yeah.
But I haven't bought a Mosrite guitar for a really long time, but I bought one a couple of months ago off of Facebook Marketplace. It looked interesting, and when I went down there, I was like, oh man, this is a freaking magic guitar. Like, it literally plays itself. So I'm not leaving this one behind. I'm taking it home, you know.
Yeah, that's killer. Well, Deak, we've talked about a couple different things. Do you got time to go ahead and get into my theory about 59 to 69 or?
Sure.
Yeah. So so one thing I did want to talk to you, Deak, was about, I just did a video on, rock and roll history, and my theory from like 1959 to 1969, I've never think of rock and roll changing as much as it did in those 10 years. And basically I started at Buddy Holly and I ended at Jimi Hendrix and at Woodstock. And to me, like, the look is totally different and the sound is totally different. But from like 69 on to now, like guitar music, it hasn't really changed that much, really. You know, you got Eddie Van Halen and all this other stuff, but still, like, in those 10 years, it just jumped leaps and bounds. And I was just wondering, what is Deke Dickerson? Why do you think that happened in those 10 years? What made the music change so much from 1959 to 1969?
Well, I've thought about this not only in terms of music, but just in terms of everything else. And, you know, first of all, I'll say that 1959 to 1969 had a definite, maybe the biggest change of any 10 years in American history. But if you look at 1949 to 1959, man, it was almost as big.
Really?
Just in terms of, you know, the music in the late 1940s, yeah, there was some hip blues and rhythm and blues and hillbilly going on, but that was pretty niche. You know, the stuff that was popular was like really mainstream, bland kind of stuff. And by the end of, you know, by 1959, you had all this wild rock and roll, and the entire musical landscape had changed. I mean, all the old performers had basically been put out of business by 1959 because of rock and roll.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm trying to lead around to is that I think a lot of it has to do with the technological innovations that happen. Because certainly what happened between 1949 and 1959 was you had all these technological innovations with electric guitar. You know, electric guitar, you know, started in even by 1949, it was basically like an archtop guitar with a floating pickup and, you know, a tiny little amp. And by the end of the 1950s, you had solid body guitars, you know, Fender Stratocasters and Gibson Flying Vs, you know, and you had things like the Tweed Twin, which was a massive 100-watt amp with two 12-inch speakers that could literally, you know, curl your hair, you know, if you turned it up loud enough. And so getting back to your question specifically about 1959 to 1969, there was a sea change of technological innovation that happened in those 10 years. You know, if we're just going to talk about guitar, you had reverb come out, you know, which first started appearing on amps around 1959, 1960. You had amps getting much bigger. You know, Fender came out with their Showman amplifiers, their dual Showman amplifiers, then followed by amplifiers like the first Marshall amps that came out. By the end of the 1960s, you've got these Marshall full stacks, and guys like Jimi Hendrix are using like 8 of them, you know? And if you can imagine like 8 Marshall full stacks all on 10, you know, if you compare that to what they had in 1959, it's like there was nothing like that in 1959.
Yeah.
And same goes with bass and drums and keyboards and PA systems, you know?
Yeah.
One thing we don't ever really talk about is, you know, I remember talking to Scotty Moore about when they first started playing to 10,000 screaming females in these arenas with Elvis Presley. And he said, yeah, there would literally be like a microphone hanging from the ceiling that would be the same mic that they would use for wrestling matches and for cattle auctions. It was like there was no public address system. It was just this very crude, like one microphone that was like a horn or, you know, maybe a couple of speakers if you were lucky. And, you know, by the end of the 1960s, you had something like the Woodstock PA system, which was insane. You know what I mean? It was like these huge line array speakers, you know, like hundreds of speakers pointing out at, you know, hundreds of thousands of people with these thousands of watts of PA amplifiers behind them. So I think the main thing when it comes to music is the technological change. Because, you know, you're just going to play music a certain way when the only thing that you have is a, you know, Fender Stratocaster and a Tweed Deluxe, and maybe you've got a reverb unit. You're just going to play a certain way. But if you have a Les Paul with a Marshall stack, you know, and then a bunch of pedals, you know, like fuzz pedals and whatever else, wah-wah pedals, and a giant PA system to boot, you're just going to play a different way. The music is going to come out differently. And I think that's exactly what happened. I mean, even if you trace it from surf music to the Beatles, to the Stones, to like the psychedelic era, to finally like, you know, the hard rock, acid rock era. It's all kind of you know, like lockstep along with whatever technological innovation came up next. And, you know, it goes along with the recording studios as well, because in the 1950s, you pretty much recorded live to mono tape. You know, maybe by the end of the 1950s, you had some studios that recorded on 3-track, which was not really like a multi-track. It was just kind of to separate left, center, right, so that you could mix it a little bit after the recording section. But, you know, by 1964, 1965, you had 4-track machines. By 1967, 68, you had 8-track machines. The very first 16-track machines came in. And, you know, by 1970, 1972, you had 16-track machines and 24-track machines that became like the de facto standard. And, you know, just the whole way you're going to record a band or a musical act is completely different if you're recording it all live to a mono, you know, 1-track tape machine. As opposed to like recording to a 24-track machine. So I think that the technological advances really made the most difference in the change in music. But then you've got all these other things that are happening too. And we talked about this briefly before this phone call. Kennedy being assassinated, you know, the Beatles coming in from England, this whole kind of even before psychedelic, there was like sort of like I'm forgetting the word. Is it op art? But you know, they're far out, way out people who were creating art and influencing culture. And I think that stuff definitely influenced the music that was happening at the same time.
So and that's great. I figured that you would come in with a technology thing, but I would imagine that's probably true. Like if you're Jimi Hendrix and you have an opportunity to get a lot of feedback, you start playing around with that thing, and then you end up basically inventing a whole new tone. And so like
I mean, just also I'll just interrupt because I remember, I think it's on the back of the first Byrds album, you know, the Mr. Tambourine album. It might be on the back of one of the other albums. But Roger McGuinn talks about how there were planes in the air with propellers, and then they turned into jet planes, and then they turned into supersonic jet planes. And he even talks about like that influenced their music. And so you can't really discount the fact that, you know, if we go back to like right after World War II, sure, there were airplanes, sure, there were cars, but everything was still pretty primitive. And, you know, like people didn't have television sets, people didn't have washing machines, you know, and by the time you get to 1969, you know, like pretty much every house in the country has a television set. Pretty much every house in the country has a car. Pretty much every house in the entire nation is like 1,000 times more technologically advanced than they were right after World War II. And I just think that all of that influenced the music a lot.
Yeah, and somewhat like I have to wax philosophical because obviously, you know, we all have phones and whatnot like that. So, and you know, you're into entertaining and music and media. So basically, it's all phones and online content, and that's how you're going to make your living. And that's basically really how you kind of do it, I would think. You know, you make money off of live gigs, but a lot of your stuff is recording for people's media content. So where do you think things are going to go from here?
Well, you know, we're already beset with so much of this AI stuff, and right now it's kind of cute, you know, like here's here's Led Zeppelin 2 as if it was done by a rockabilly band and all that kind of stuff. And you know, I listen to some of that stuff, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands of these AI videos on YouTube already.
Yeah.
And you know, like a fake 60s singer named Bobo something or another who does these filthy songs like I crapped my pants last night. And it's like, okay, yeah, I find this amusing. And I think it's interesting that, you know, these AI recordings can sound like an authentic 60s soul record or sound like an authentic 50s rockabilly record. But, you know, as we get further and further into AI, man, you just get further removed from the human experience. And I think that ultimately people just kind of reject that. I mean, it's happened in the past. And I think it's sort of happening now a little bit because we're realizing just how addicted we are to our cell phones and social media and things like that. And I think that that the further that we get into AI, it's you know, obviously maybe there won't be a America's Got Talent show anymore because it'll just be AI's Got Talent. You know what I mean? I don't know. But I'm not really I'm not that worried about that because I think that the backlash will be that there will be these kids who see all this AI stuff and they'll just think, yeah, this is just kind of crap. And they'll buy a trombone and start trying to learn how to play 1920s jazz. You know, I'm astounded here in Los Angeles at the number of really exceptional young traditional jazz musicians. I mean, we've got a bunch of them, and it's like, where did these kids come from? And they basically rejected all of the technology that was getting thrown in their faces when they were kids in the 2000s. You know, they were just like, no. I'd rather, like, you know, wear a seersucker suit and, you know, buy a cornet or a trombone and some lace-up shoes from the 1930s, and that's my bag, you know. And I can totally relate because in the 80s when there was all these kind of bands like Flock of Seagulls and Haircut 100, I wanted to hear something that was real, you know, that was just like guitar, bass, and drums. And like, you know, kind of played live on stage and not a bunch of technological crap. So I think there's always going to be a backlash to that creates really good art.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. You know, like obviously when you go down like Frenchman Street in New Orleans, and everyone's got horns, and there's like a PA for the singer, but everyone else is playing acoustic. You know, and it's really good.
Yeah.
And you think like, man, this is probably the way these clubs sounded. They've sounded like this for 80 years or 100 years. And there's something soulful about it. Like it brings you in. And like, you know, I still think, you know, like you play a lot of live gigs. And like, what is the live scene now for you? And what other bands are you playing with now? And is that live scene still kicking?
The live scene is still kicking. It's definitely changed. You know, like for years and years and years, I would go on these tours all the time where I would be in a van playing 20 or 30 shows over the course of a month or 6 weeks. And, you know, you'd be playing all these different towns, you know, like you'd be playing Fort Wayne, Indiana on a Tuesday night. And you could make a living and do well with that.
Yeah.
But what's happened in recent years is that you've still got these places that are music meccas, you know, like Chicago, Illinois, Austin, Texas, you know, New York City, etc. And you can do really well there, but it's just almost become impossible to do the month-long tours where you're going and playing Fort Wayne, Indiana on a Tuesday night. It just doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
Especially, you know, with the price of gas and the price of hotels and stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm still doing basically what I've been doing for many, many years. It's just kind of modified.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that I always used to bring my own band, the Echophonics.
Yeah.
And when the Echophonics broke up, number one, I've started a great new band, Deak and the Whippersnappers, with some younger guys here in town.
Seen them.
And
They're good.
I'm really proud of that band. I think it's an excellent band.
Great band.
And you know, if there's a festival offer or weeks worth of shows where we can go out with the Whippersnappers and we can stay in hotel rooms and we can all come home with money, then we do that. But then there's also a lot of things where they're like, well, we want you to fly to Switzerland and backed by this Swiss group for a festival. And, like, it's good money for me, but if we brought the whole band over, like, nobody would make money because of the plane tickets and things. Yeah. So it's just, I'm still doing what I've always been doing. Things just have to be sort of modified a bit.
Yeah. Well, that's good. So, well, Deak, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I did want to get into, like, if you could just kind of roughly tell us, what is your job? Like, everything that you do, it's like you kind of carved out this whole niche for yourself, like musician, recording, history guy, book writer. What would you qualify your job and kind of list the things that you do?
Well, as soon as you said that, I remembered, I moved out here to California in 1991, and I had a couple of different day jobs, including one that lasted for 4 or 5 years. And it was a good paying job. I was making more than I had ever made in anything before. And they fired me because I was taking too much time off to go play music. I was playing with Dave and Deak combo, and, we'd have these 3-day weekends or 4-day trips or a week here or whatever. So they finally fired me. And that was in 1996. And I remember thinking, okay, I'm never going to have a job again. I don't care what it takes. I'm not going to ever have a job again.
Yeah.
If it kills me, I'm not going to have a job, just because I really, really hated working for somebody else.
Yeah.
And so, what that has turned into is, I always get accused of being a workaholic, because just in order to pay bills, in order to keep the roof over my head and to keep this whole thing going, I mean, basically it's like I wake up in the morning and I start working, and I work until the minute that I lay my head on the pillow and close my eyes every single day of the week.
Yeah.
And, people often are like, well, like, have you checked out this TV series, or did you see this movie? It's like, no, man, I don't have time to do that. I'm booking shows. I'm practicing for this festival. I'm recording something. I'm mixing something. Like, it's always working on something. And I realized a while back that just doing live gigs was not going to pay the bills. Obviously, if I could get nice movie gigs like those Johnny Knoxville things, several a year, then I'd be doing really well, and maybe I could have some free time. But those come along like every couple of years. So I started doing all these other things just to kind of take up the slack, the recording studio work, and writing magazine articles and writing books, and even sometimes just buying and selling junk, like every now and then I'll find something on the road and turn it around. And I do all kinds of things just to keep the bills paid, and just to keep this whole, I'm not going to refer to myself in the third person, but just to keep this whole train going that I started so long ago, because I swore I was never going to have a job.
Yeah. Hey, man. Well, thanks, Deak, for giving us the lowdown on that whole thing. And, anyways, thanks for.
I will just say this.
Yeah, go ahead.
If any kid asks me today, like, "Gee, Mr. Dickerson, can I do what you did?" I would say, "No, man, you can't," because so many of those opportunities, especially for playing music and making money playing music, they are gone. Like, if you were to start playing now, a lot of the opportunities that were afforded me over the last 30 years, they just don't exist anymore. So. I would not tell any kids to follow in my footsteps unless they were completely unemployable like me. Then maybe you have to. But that would be my advice.
No, that's good, man. Basically it's 29 years you've been doing it, so you're doing something right,
Yeah.
Well, anyways, Deak, man, thank you so much for being on the West Coast Ramble and sharing all your stories. That's what we want to know. And also, if you ever come through Nashville, you could sleep on the couch here in the studio. All I would request is that your band play a couple songs for the show.
All right. Well, we'll try to figure that out next time I'm in Nashville. I was just there right after Thanksgiving. I don't think we just talked about that.
No,
I played
man.
a show at the East Side Bowl. Yeah. And I actually did some research for the Mosrite book while I was in town. Pretty interesting stuff over at the Country Music Hall of Fame. I got to photograph Glenn Campbell's Mosrite guitar.
Oh, wow.
And I had photographed other Mosrite guitars there last year, but they had just got that Glenn Campbell guitar from the Marty Stewart collection. And also went by the Grand Ole Opry Museum collection and got to see some really interesting things over there.
Didn't you get backstage on that with Marty Stewart?
Well, I did go backstage with Marty Stewart, but separate from that, they actually have a Grand Ole Opry Museum and archives, and it's in a separate building. And I got an invitation to come there to see some guitars that they had and some photos and things that I could use for my book. Whoa. So it's really nice to get access to things like that. It makes you feel like, wow, okay, they must think I'm legit, So I got to keep acting like I'm legit.
Yeah, well, I can't think of anyone else who's out there like keeping the history alive with so much fervor, and with so much passion. It's not like you're doing this to get rich. It's like you're doing a good work like you did with the Deak's Guitar Geek Festival, but now a lot of those people are gone, but you're carrying it on in books and history. So I know I appreciate it. So
I like, part of the reason I'm self-employed is I like doing things that I like. And, one of the things that I really wanted to try to get going was some sort of reality show. And I even shot a pilot for a reality show that was called Deak's America. And it was all about, I would go to a different town every week, and you would go to antique stores and look at junk, and you would find the local old diner or the most interesting kind of like roadside America attraction that town had, and then at the end you'd like play some music with some local guys and have it be like some sort of regional flavored music depending on where you were at. And I thought it was a really good idea. Unfortunately, when we pitched it to some of the reality show people, they were like, yeah, this is too niche, like people don't really care about music. It's got to have like big celebrities attached. And so the guy that I was working with was like, well, why don't we make this like a guitar show thing, but you could focus, on some of these blues rock players who are so popular, the Jeff Becks and the Jimmy Pages and the Eric Claptons and so forth. And I'm like, I'd rather slit my throat, actually, So, maybe that's the problem is I'm just no good at like taking an offer like that might turn out to be something good. But if I had to listen to that music all day long, I literally would kill myself. I hate that kind of music. So I'm just very lucky that, I've been able to do what I do and keep the bills paid, farming my weird little corner of the field over there, with my little old hand plow, you know what I mean?
Hey man, I've worked in reality television long enough, and they would say, look, man, you're going to have some hot chick get mad at you and throw wine at you, or, have someone smash your guitar. Can we do that just once to get it going, and
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you'd be locked into a contract, and then you'd be bitter and you'd want to leave anyway. So I think you'd made the right choice.
Well, I'm still not giving up on the idea because I think that I would be good at hosting a show like that. It just needs to find the right audience, and the right people to sort of put it on the air.
Hey, well, maybe someone, you see this, send them a request, do a sizzle reel.
Absolutely.
All right, hey, thanks a lot, Deak, for being here, man. I really appreciate it, and we'll get you next time you're here in Nashville. Thanks a lot.
It's been great talking to you, man. Thanks again.
All right, see ya. Thanks.